Hello. My name is Jake, and my wife Megan and I had been married for 14 years. Life had settled into its usual patterns, a comfortable routine of work, chores, and weekends that felt like they blended into each other. While our relationship lacked the fiery passion of its early days, I thought it was solid, built on years of trust and shared experiences. Megan had recently taken a more social turn in her life. She started attending yoga classes 3 times a week and meeting new people. She became particularly close with a group from the gym, and over time, they began hanging out outside of class. I didn't think much of it at first. Megan deserved to have a social life, and I was happy she was enjoying herself. Her newfound energy and enthusiasm seemed harmless, if not refreshing. But then, little things began to stick out. It started innocently enough. Megan was suddenly glued to her phone more often than usual, laughing at messages and smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years. If I asked about it, she would casually say it was a group chat with her yoga friends. Then there were the girls' nights, which became more frequent, and the occasional weekend retreats she claimed were all about relaxation and self-care. Looking back, I should have seen it earlier, but hindsight is always clearer. One Friday night, Megan told me she was heading out with her friends to celebrate a birthday. I offered to drop her off, but she waved me off with a nervous laugh, insisting she drive herself. Something about her dismissive tone lingered in my mind long after she left. That night, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling. Her recent habits, combined with her evasive answers, left me restless. Around 10:30, I noticed Megan's laptop still open on the kitchen counter. She often used it to check our joint accounts, so I figured I'd confirm a payment for a bill I'd forgotten to ask her about earlier. But as I logged in, I stumbled across something I wasn't looking for. A series of emails stood out, confirmations for dinner reservations, hotel bookings, and even spa treatments. The kicker? They weren't for locations in town. They were booked under a pseudonym I'd never seen her use before. As my eyes scanned the details, my stomach churned. One reservation was for that very night, at a luxury hotel not far from the city center. I grabbed my keys and left the house. Driving to the hotel felt surreal. My chest was tight, and every breath came harder than the last. When I arrived, I parked in the shadow of the building and walked to the front desk. Clutching a bouquet of flowers I'd picked up as an alibi, I plastered on a fake smile and approached the receptionist. "Hi," I began, forcing a friendly tone. "I'm here to surprise my wife. She's staying here tonight." The woman behind the counter smiled back. "Of course. What's the name?" "Megan Green," I replied, hoping my voice didn't betray my racing heart. The receptionist typed on her keyboard for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up with a cheery expression. "Room 214. I nodded, thanking her before making my way to the elevator. Each floor that passed only heightened the storm inside me. When I reached the door to 214, I stood frozen. A muffled laugh from within spurred me into action. My hand shook as I knocked twice. Megan answered after a pause, clearly startled. Her expression shifted from confusion to panic the moment she saw me. I caught a glimpse of the room behind her, dim lighting, an open bottle of wine, and the unmistakable shadow of a man retreating into the bathroom. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice a mix of shock and annoyance. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, my tone icy, "but I think I already know." Megan's cheeks flushed as she scrambled to close the door. I wedged my foot in before she could shut me out. "Jake, let's talk about this later," she pleaded, her voice trembling now. "There's nothing to talk about," I shot back. "I've seen enough." I turned and walked away, ignoring her desperate calls after me. By the time I reached my car, tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. The drive home was a haze. My mind replayed the scene over and over. Questions buzzed like angry wasps. How long had this been going on? Who was the guy? Did she ever think I wouldn't find out? By the time I reached the driveway, I was no closer to answers. Instead, I resolved to take control. Whatever her reasons, her betrayal had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkened living room, staring at my wedding photo on the mantel, trying to reconcile the woman in the picture with the one I'd just left behind at that hotel. This wasn't going to end here. I would get answers, but more importantly, I would take back control of my life. Megan's betrayal might have blindsided me, but the divorce? That was going to be on my terms. And this was only the beginning. The days after discovering Megan's betrayal were some of the longest of my life. Every moment felt heavier, as if the air itself were conspiring to keep me locked in place. While she stayed out that night, I began preparing for what came next. This wasn't just about confronting her anymore. It was about regaining control of a situation I never wanted to be in. Megan came home the following morning, slipping through the front door like a thief, returning to the scene of the crime. She looked disheveled, her usual poise replaced with guilt and unease. I sat in the living room, the remnants of a sleepless night scattered around me, a half-empty cup of coffee, a legal pad filled with notes, and my phone with a growing list of lawyers' numbers. "Jake," she started, her voice soft, almost apologetic. I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't bother lying. I know everything." Her face crumpled as she sank into the chair across from me. For a moment, I thought she might try to explain herself, but the words didn't come. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked down at her lap. "Who is he?" I asked bluntly, the question slicing through the silence. Megan hesitated, biting her lip before answering. "His name is Chris. He's from the gym." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "And how long has this been going on?" "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "It didn't just happen, Megan. You made choices, every step of the way." She didn't argue, just sat there, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was a far cry from the confident, radiant woman I'd married years ago. And yet, I felt no sympathy. Over the next few days, I stayed focused on what I could control. I met with a lawyer, laid out the evidence I'd gathered, and started the process of protecting myself. Megan and I shared several accounts, but I moved quickly to separate my finances, freezing any shared cards to ensure she couldn't drain them. I also began documenting everything: emails, text messages, and even photos from her social media that hinted at her affair. Megan didn't fight me. If anything, she seemed resigned to the fact that our marriage was over. She stayed out late most nights, avoiding me as much as possible. When we did cross paths, the tension was palpable, an invisible wall separating us in our own home. One evening, I found myself scrolling through her Instagram, trying to piece together the timeline of her betrayal. It wasn't hard to spot the subtle signs. Photos of her at the gym, captions about new beginnings and finding herself, and the increasing presence of Chris in group photos. All of it painted a picture I hadn't wanted to see before. That's when I found it, a tagged post from one of her friends. It was a boomerang clip of a group at a bar, Megan and Chris standing far too close for comfort. He had his arm around her waist, and she was leaning into him, laughing like nothing else in the world mattered. The timestamp on the post was from the night she'd told me she was at a book club meeting. The betrayal felt fresh all over again, but it also strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just going to let this slide. Megan had taken liberties with our marriage, our finances, and my trust. It was time to show her what it felt like to lose control. I reached out to a private investigator to gather more concrete evidence. While I had enough to prove infidelity, I wanted leverage, not for revenge, but to ensure the divorce settlement worked in my favor. If Megan thought she could waltz out of our marriage without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. The investigator was efficient. Within days, he provided photos and videos of Megan and Chris together, kissing in parking lots, holding hands during what were clearly supposed to be business lunches, and even entering hotels together. The proof was undeniable. When I confronted Megan with the evidence, her reaction was a mix of shame and anger. She accused me of invading her privacy, as if I were the one who had crossed a line. "This isn't about privacy, Megan," I snapped. "It's about accountability. You made this mess, and now you have to deal with the consequences." She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I let her go. There was no point in arguing with someone who refused to take responsibility for their actions. That night, I sat in the quiet of our once shared home, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The life we'd built together was crumbling, but amidst the rubble, I found a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Megan anymore. It was about me reclaiming my future. The next step was reaching out to friends and family. I knew the story would come out eventually, and I wanted to be the one to control the narrative. It wasn't easy admitting what had happened, but the support I received was overwhelming. People who I thought would side with Megan surprised me with their understanding and encouragement. One of my closest friends, Mark, even offered to help me move out once the divorce was finalized. "You don't have to face this alone," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "We've got your back." His words were a lifeline, reminding me that there was still hope for the future, even if it felt distant. As the days turned into weeks, I began to focus on rebuilding. I started going to the gym again, not to punish myself, but to channel the anger and frustration into something productive. Each session felt like a small victory, a reminder that I still had control over my own body and mind, even if my marriage was slipping away. Megan, meanwhile, seemed to be spiraling. Her nights out grew wilder, her social media posts more erratic. It was clear that she was struggling to come to terms with the fallout of her actions, but I refused to let her chaos drag me down. I had a plan, and I was sticking to it. The divorce was just the beginning. By the time Megan realized just how much she had lost, it was already too late. The lawyer's notice of intent for divorce had been served, and she came home that evening furious. I was ready for her reaction. She barged into the house, the papers in her hand. "What the hell, Jake?" she yelled, slamming them on the dining table. "You didn't even talk to me before filing for divorce?" I stayed seated, calm, as if her outburst barely registered. "Talk to you? Like you talked to me before sleeping with Chris?" My voice was steady, void of emotion. "Save the theatrics, Megan. We're past that." Her face twisted, caught between guilt and defiance. "It was a mistake, okay? I've already told you I'm sorry. But divorce? Isn't that extreme?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "It's not extreme, Megan. It's necessary. You broke this marriage, not me." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. The fire in her eyes dimmed as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Without a word, she turned and walked away, retreating to the bedroom. Megan's betrayal had left me raw, but I wasn't about to let it define me. Over the next week, I focused on consolidating my resources and preparing for the inevitable battle. Megan didn't know it yet, but I had more than enough evidence to ensure she walked away with little more than her personal belongings. One night, after she had gone to bed, I received a call from the private investigator. "Got something you might want to see," he said, his tone a mix of professionalism and grim satisfaction. He emailed me a video of Megan and Chris arguing in the parking lot of the gym. From the body language, it was clear things weren't going well for them. Chris stormed off, leaving Megan standing alone, visibly upset. It was a small moment of vindication. Her affair wasn't the grand romantic escape she'd probably imagined. Instead, it was unraveling as quickly as our marriage. I decided it was time to push back in ways Megan wouldn't expect. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting boundaries and reclaiming my life. The first step was cutting off any remaining financial ties. I closed our joint credit cards and transferred my direct deposit to a separate account. I also changed the locks on the house, informing Megan that while she could stay until the divorce was finalized, her access would be on my terms. When I handed her a new key, she looked at it as though it were a hand grenade. "What is this?" she asked. "A reminder that you're a guest here now," I replied flatly, "until you find somewhere else to stay." She didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes. The turning point came 2 weeks later. Megan had tried to reach out to Chris to rekindle their relationship, but he had stopped responding. I knew this because the investigator had managed to access a thread of texts where Chris explicitly told her that he didn't want to deal with her baggage. I hadn't planned to use that information against her, but Megan gave me the opening one evening when she returned home drunk. She stumbled through the door, her makeup smeared and her hair disheveled. "You happy now?" she slurred, dropping her purse onto the floor. "You've ruined everything." I stayed seated on the couch, watching her with a detached curiosity. "I ruined everything? You might want to rethink that statement." She plopped onto the armchair across from me, glaring. "Chris doesn't want me anymore." You've scared him off with your crazy stalker act." I laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Chris doesn't want you because he never did. You were just convenient, Megan. A fling. And now that the fun's over, he's moved on." Her face crumpled, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She tried to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and started to cry. I felt no satisfaction in her misery. If anything, it only highlighted how far we'd fallen. But I couldn't let her tears sway me. This wasn't about her redemption. It was about my survival. The next day, I made the ultimate move to protect myself. I reached out to Megan's parents, who had always been supportive of our marriage, and told them the truth. They were shocked and deeply disappointed. Her father, a stern and pragmatic man, promised to speak with her and urged me to do what I needed to move forward. That evening, Megan came to me, her demeanor subdued. "Dad called," she said quietly, sitting at the edge of the couch. "He's not happy." "I'm sure he isn't," I replied, not looking up from the papers I was reviewing. She hesitated before continuing. "Do you really think we're beyond fixing this?" I met her gaze, my expression unyielding. "Yes, Megan, we are. And it's time you accept that." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. But this time she didn't argue. She knew I was done. The next steps were clinical. We divided our assets under the guidance of our lawyers, and I ensured that the evidence of her infidelity was well documented in case she tried to push for more than she deserved. Each meeting was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, but it also felt like a step toward freedom. By the end of the third week, Megan began packing her things. Watching her load box after box into her car was surreal, a painful reminder of everything we had built together and everything she had destroyed. But as she drove away for the last time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. This wasn't the end I had imagined for my marriage, but it was the beginning of something new. I was battered, but not broken. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. Goodbye,